My name is Elena Moros, and the first thing you should know is that I didn't come to the stable looking for salvation. I came because I needed somewhere quiet enough to hear my own thoughts break. The morning I arrived, the sky was the color of wet ash, heavy and undecided. I remember gripping the steering wheel long after I'd parked, my knuckles pale, my breath shallow, as if the car were the last thin wall between the person I used to be and the version of myself I'd been avoiding. I told myself I was only here to volunteer. Temporary, anonymous, horses didn't care about resumes or past mistakes or the way grief lodged itself behind the ribs and refused to move. Horses were simple. Feed them, brush them, clean the stalls, leave. That was the lie I needed to tell myself to open the door. The stable smelled like hay and earth and something warm and alive. Wood creaked under my boots as I stepped inside, the sound echoing louder than it should have, like the building was already listening. Light slipped through narrow windows, cutting the dust into floating galaxies. Somewhere deeper inside, a horse shifted its weight, metal lightly chiming as a halter moved. I stood there too long, frozen by the strange intimacy of it. The quiet wasn't empty, it was occupied, full. It pressed against my ears until I became aware of my own heartbeat, loud and uneven. I'd spent the last year avoiding places like this, places where nothing drowned me out, places where there was nowhere to hide. I followed the sound, my steps cautious, almost apologetic. Stall doors lined the aisle like sentinels, each one holding a life larger than mine, each breath behind them slow and deliberate. I passed chestnut coats, dark eyes that glanced up and away, tails flicking lazily. I kept my gaze forward, afraid of being seen too clearly. And then I reached the last stall on the left. He didn't move when I stopped. That was the first thing that undid me. No shuffle, no snort, just stillness. He stood with his head lowered, mane falling in uneven waves, one foreleg bent in rest. His coat was the color of old storms, deep gray with hints of silver where the light caught it. I felt him look at me before he lifted his head. I felt it like pressure behind my sternum, like a held breath. When his eyes met mine, something inside me stalled. They were dark, almost black, but not empty. Focused, steady, he didn't flinch, didn't blink away. He simply watched me, as if he had all the time in the world and had decided to spend it on me. I swallowed hard, suddenly aware of how exposed I was, how thin my skin felt. "Hi," I whispered, the word slipping out before I could stop it. He exhaled slowly, a long breath through his nose, and the sound wrapped around me. Not loud, not dramatic, just there, present. I don't know how long we stood like that. Seconds, minutes. Time does strange things when you're being looked at without judgment, when nothing is demanded of you, when you're not expected to perform or explain or smile at the right moments. Someone called my name down the aisle, and I startled like I'd been caught doing something private. A woman appeared older, sun-lined, her movements easy in the space. She smiled at me, quick and knowing. "You must be Elena," she said. "I'm Ruth. Glad you made it." I nodded, words temporarily misplaced. My eyes flicked back to the stall. "That's Ash," Ruth added, following my gaze. "He's quiet, observant, doesn't waste energy on nonsense." Ash. The name settled into me, heavy and soft all at once. Ruth handed me a brush and gestured toward the stall. "You can start with him if you'd like. He prefers calm hands." Calm. The word almost made me laugh. I hadn't felt calm in months. My insides were a tangle of half-processed memories and emotions that refused to line up neatly. But I nodded anyway, because something in Ash's stillness felt like an invitation I didn't want to refuse. I stepped inside the stall, the door left open behind me. The space was warmer here, the air thick with the scent of him hay, sweat, something faintly sweet. My pulse skidded. I kept my movements slow, deliberate, like I was approaching a wild thing, instead of a creature that outweighed me by hundreds of pounds. "Okay," I murmured, mostly to myself. "Okay." I reached out, my hand hovering inches from his neck. I hesitated, a familiar fear rising, the fear of touching something real and having it pull away, the fear of doing it wrong. Ash leaned into my hand before I made contact. The sensation hit me so hard I had to brace my other hand against the stall wall. His warmth seeped into my palm, solid and grounding. He didn't push, didn't crowd me, just rested there, accepting. My chest tightened without warning. I began brushing, long strokes that followed the curve of his muscles. The rhythm steadied my breathing. Each pass of the brush pulled dust and loose hair free, small clouds drifting down. Ash shifted slightly, adjusting his weight, trusting me to stay with him. As I worked, my thoughts started to surface, the kind that usually stayed buried under noise and distraction. Memories I hadn't invited. The image of an empty apartment, a phone that hadn't rung. Words I'd never said because I'd been afraid of saying them too late. I pressed my lips together, focusing on the brush, the sound it made against his coat. Scrape. Pause. Scrape. It felt like a conversation without language. "I'm not very good at staying," I whispered, the confession slipping out before I could catch it. The stall absorbed the words. Ash flicked an ear, but didn't move away. I told myself it didn't matter. He didn't understand. Horses didn't care about broken timelines, or the weight of almosts. But my voice kept going, soft and unguarded, in a way it hadn't been with anyone else. "I leave before things can leave me," I said. "It's easier that way, or it used to be." Ash breathed, slow and deep, his side expanding beneath my hand. The rise and fall became something I matched without thinking. In, out, in, out. The world narrowed to that moment, the quiet stall, the steady presence beside me, the simple task of brushing a horse. For the first time in a long while, my thoughts didn't feel like enemies. They were just there. Acknowledged, not chased away. When I finished, I stepped back, my arms heavy, my heart strangely lighter. Ash lifted his head, turning it slightly toward me, and for a fleeting second, I thought he was going to step closer. Instead, he stayed where he was, eyes on mine, as if asking something I didn't yet have words for. Ruth appeared again, clapping her hands softly. "Lunch break," she said. "You did good." I wanted to tell her that brushing Ash felt like exhaling after holding my breath for a year. That something in me had shifted, subtle but undeniable. Instead, I just nodded and followed her out, leaving the stall door open. All through lunch, my mind drifted back. To the weight of his presence. To the way the silence had felt less like absence and more like companionship. I tried to remind myself that this was temporary. That I didn't belong here. That getting attached to anything was dangerous. But when the afternoon chores began, and Ruth assigned me to clean tack near the far end of the stable, my eyes kept finding their way back to Ash's stall. He was watching me. Not constantly, not intensely, just aware. Every time I glanced over, his gaze met mine like a held note. By the time the day wound down, the sky outside had cleared, light slanting low and gold through the windows. Dust danced again, brighter this time. Ruth thanked me, told me I could come back whenever I liked. Whenever I liked. The phrase echoed in my head as I walked back toward Ash's stall, something pulling me there with quiet insistence. I stopped at the threshold, unsure. This felt like crossing a line I'd drawn for myself long ago. "I'm heading out," I said softly, feeling foolish for announcing it. "I just wanted to say goodbye." Ash stepped forward then, closing the distance until his breath warmed my shoulder. I stiffened, then relaxed as his presence settled around me, solid and unafraid. He didn't touch me this time. He just stood there, close enough that I could feel the truth of him without being overwhelmed. Something cracked. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just a thin fracture in the shell I'd been living inside. I rested my forehead briefly against the cool wood of the stall door, eyes closed. The day pressed back in the drive home, the empty rooms, the familiar ache waiting patiently for me. I didn't want to carry it all alone anymore. "I'll come back," I whispered, surprising myself with how much I meant it. Ash exhaled, a soft huff that stirred my hair. I stepped away before I could change my mind, the sound of my boots louder now, my chest tight with a feeling I couldn't quite name. Hope, maybe. Or the fear of it. As I reached the end of the aisle, I looked back once more. Ash hadn't moved. He was still watching. Still present. Still exactly where I'd left him. And for the first time in a very long time, the thought of returning somewhere didn't make me feel trapped. It made me feel seen. It made me feel seen. The word followed me all the way to my car, clung to me as I drove home with the windows cracked open, dusk pouring in like a slow exhale. I kept replaying the moment in the stall the way Ash hadn't followed me, hadn't demanded anything, hadn't turned away either. He had simply been there, waiting without waiting. And something about that unsettled me more than if he had chased after me or ignored me completely. My apartment greeted me with its usual stillness, too clean, too quiet, the kind of silence that echoed back at you when you weren't careful. I dropped my keys into the bowl by the door and stood there longer than necessary, listening to nothing. No hooves, no breathing beside me, just the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic that never quite reached me. I told myself not to romanticize it. Horses were intuitive, yes, but they weren't therapists. They didn't hold meaning the way humans did. What I'd felt was projection, loneliness grasping for shape. And yet, when I closed my eyes that night, it wasn't my own thoughts that filled the dark. It was the memory of steady breathing, the weight of calm, the way my body had softened without being asked to. Sleep came in fragments. I dreamed of doors wooden, heavy, half open, of standing in thresholds, unsure whether I was arriving or leaving. Every time I reached out to push one open, I woke with my heart racing, my hands empty. By morning, the decision had already been made somewhere beneath my consciousness. I returned to the stable 2 days later. I told myself it was practical. Volunteering required consistency. Ruth would expect me. I needed something to anchor my weeks. All of that was true. But none of it explained the way my pulse picked up as the familiar shape of the barn came into view, or how my chest tightened with something dangerously close to anticipation. The sky was brighter this time, blue stretched thin and hopeful. The gravel crunched under my tires, loud in the quiet morning. I sat in the car again, hands resting in my lap, breathing like I was about to walk into something that might change me. Inside, the stable hummed with low life, horses shifting, hay rustling, the muted clank of metal. Ruth waved from the far end, already busy. She didn't stop me, didn't question my return. She just nodded, like she'd known all along. I went straight to Ash. He was standing this time, head lifted, ears forward. When he saw me, something in his posture shifted, not sudden, not dramatic, just a subtle realignment, like a compass needle finding north. "Hey," I murmured, the word warmer now, less tentative. I stepped into the stall, closing the door behind me with deliberate care. The sound was soft but final, wood meeting wood. I noticed it more than I had the first time, a flicker of awareness passing through me. Enclosed spaces had never been my favorite, but Ash didn't react, and neither did I. Not yet. I brushed him again, finding comfort in the familiar rhythm. The movements came easier, my hands more confident. I talked more to quiet fragments of thought, half-finished sentences I'd never trusted anyone else with. I didn't explain. I didn't organize. I just let them fall. "I used to think strength meant staying untouched," I said at one point, my voice barely above the sound of bristles against coat. Like if nothing got close enough, nothing could hurt me. Ash shifted, turning slightly so I had better access to his side. The trust in the gesture pressed against me, heavy and undeniable. I was wrong, I continued. Or maybe incomplete. The word hung there, incomplete. It fit too well. Days turned into weeks. I came back again and again, folding the stable into my routine until it felt less like an escape and more like a parallel life. Mornings before work. Afternoons when the walls of my apartment closed in. Evenings when the sun dipped low and the air grew thick with the smell of cooling earth. Each time, Ash met me the same way. Present. Unrushed. He learned the sound of my footsteps. I learned the subtle language of his movements, the flick of an ear, the shift of weight that meant restlessness, the stillness that meant contentment. We existed side by side, and in that quiet companionship, something in me began to loosen. Not heal, not yet. Healing implied an end point. This was more like thawing. One afternoon, Ruth watched us from the aisle, her gaze thoughtful. "He's taken to you," she said, not unkindly. I shrugged, suddenly self-conscious. "He's just calm." She smiled, the corners of her eyes creasing. Calm doesn't mean empty. Some of the deepest waters look still from the surface. The words followed me long after she'd walked away. It was during my 4th week that the tension began to change shape. It started small, an awareness of space, of doors, of exits. I hadn't noticed at first how often I positioned myself near the stall opening, how my body angled subtly toward escape even when my mind was focused elsewhere. But once I did notice, I couldn't unsee it. The realization brought with it a familiar tightening in my chest. I tried to ignore it. One evening, the light outside dimmed faster than I expected. Clouds rolled in thick and low, swallowing the horizon. The stable grew darker, shadows stretching long across the floor. Ruth had already left, her truck's engine fading into the distance. I told myself I'd finish quickly. Ash stood quietly as I brushed him, but there was a new energy in the air, charged, anticipatory. Thunder murmured somewhere far off, a low growl that vibrated through the walls. The first crack of thunder came closer than I expected. I flinched before I could stop myself, my hand jerking mid-stroke. Ash startled too, a sharp intake of breath, muscles tensing beneath my palm. For a split second, we were both on edge, mirrors of each other's unease. "It's okay," I whispered automatically, though I wasn't sure who I was trying to calm. Rain began to fall, heavy and sudden, drumming against the roof in a way that swallowed all other sound. The stable seemed to shrink, the world outside reduced to streaks of water and flashes of light. I became acutely aware of the door behind me. The air felt thicker, harder to breathe. I told myself it was nothing, just weather, just old instincts misfiring. Another crack of thunder, louder this time. Ash stamped a hoof, then settled again, choosing stillness over panic. I watched him, forcing my breathing to match his. In, out. "You're braver than I am," I murmured, a shaky smile pulling at my lips. The words barely left my mouth before the lights flickered. Once, twice, then went out. Darkness rushed in, sudden and complete. Not pitch black, there was still the faint glow of lightning through the windows, but enough to make my stomach drop. My first instinct was to move, to open the door, to leave. I reached for the latch and stopped. The thunder hit again, close enough to feel in my bones. The rain intensified, a relentless roar that made the world feel sealed off. I stood there, hand hovering inches from the door, heart pounding hard enough to hurt. Ash shifted, stepping closer to me in the darkness. I felt his warmth before I saw him, a solid presence cutting through the rising panic. I froze, not in fear of him, but in fear of what staying might mean. The stable door was closed. Not locked, not trapped, just closed. A boundary I could cross if I chose to. I didn't. My breath came shallow, each inhale scraping against my chest. The walls felt closer now, the space between them shrinking with every thought I didn't want to think. I wasn't trapped. I was choosing to stay. Ash's side brushed my arm, grounding me in the present. He didn't crowd me, didn't push, just existed close enough to remind me I wasn't alone in the dark. I leaned back against the stall wall, sliding down until I was sitting on the straw-covered floor. My knees drew up instinctively, arms wrapping around them in a posture I hadn't realized I still remembered. "It's stupid," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the rain. "I know it's stupid." Ash lowered his head, his breath warm against my shoulder. The steady rhythm cut through the chaos in my head, an anchor in the storm. Memories surfaced, uninvited closed rooms, raised voices, doors that shut too hard and stayed shut too long. The feeling of being small, of having no exit, of learning that silence was safer than resistance. I squeezed my eyes shut, jaw clenched, willing the past to stay where it belonged. But Ash stayed. Minutes passed, or seconds, time blurred at the edges. The thunder began to move farther away, each rumble softer than the last. The rain eased from a roar to a steady patter. My breathing slowed, matching the calm beside me. When the lights finally flickered back on, I didn't jump. I opened my eyes slowly, blinking against the sudden brightness. Ash stood over me, close enough that I could see every detail, the faint scars beneath his coat, the slow intelligence in his eyes. I laughed then. A short, surprised sound that broke free before I could stop it. It wasn't joy, not exactly, it was release. "I stayed," I said, more to myself than to him. Ash breathed. I pushed myself to my feet, legs unsteady but holding. My hand rested against his neck, fingers curling into his mane. The contact felt earned now, something forged in shared stillness rather than habit. The door behind me remained closed. For the first time, it didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a choice. And standing there in the aftermath of the storm, with a horse who had witnessed my quiet unraveling without judgment or demand, I understood something I'd been circling for weeks without naming. Healing wasn't about escaping the dark. It was about learning how to stand inside it without disappearing. I opened the stall door then, the sound gentle, controlled. Fresh air drifted in, cool and clean. I stepped out, then paused, turning back one last time. Ash hadn't followed. He stood where he was, calm and steady, watching me with those unflinching eyes. Not because he couldn't leave, but because he trusted I would come back. And I did, again and again, because for the first time in years, staying didn't feel like surrender. It felt like strength waiting to be claimed. It felt like strength waiting to be claimed. The realization stayed with me long after I left the stable that night, settling into my bones with a quiet persistence. I noticed it in small ways at first, in how I didn't rush to fill silence anymore, in how I let conversations pause without apologizing, in how I stood a little taller when memories tried to fold me inward. None of it was dramatic. There were no grand declarations or sudden transformations, just a subtle shift, like learning a new center of gravity. I kept returning. Some days, the stable was alive with motion, other volunteers laughing softly, the scrape of hooves on packed earth, the rhythmic choreography of care and routine. Other days, it was just me and Ash and the low hum of a place that knew how to hold space without commentary. Our bond deepened without ceremony. I learned his moods the way you learn the weather in a place you love. The restless days when he paced and needed longer walks. The quiet afternoons when he preferred to stand, head lowered, content to exist side by side. He learned me too. I felt it in the way he'd lift his head when my footsteps approached, in how he'd angle his body to make room for me without being asked. I stopped talking as much after a while. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I didn't always need to say it out loud. Some thoughts felt complete just being felt. Ash didn't demand articulation. He accepted presence as communication. One early morning, as mist clung low to the fields beyond the stable, Ruth asked if I wanted to try leading him out to the paddock. "You don't have to," she said, reading something in my posture. "But I think you're ready." The word landed heavier than she probably intended. Ready. I hesitated only a moment before nodding. The halter felt cool and solid in my hands as I clipped it on, my movements careful but confident. Ash stood still, trusting. That trust hummed between us, delicate and powerful all at once. Leading him out was less about control and more about agreement. We moved together, our pace unhurried. The world felt wide and open, the morning air crisp against my skin. When we reached the paddock, I unclipped the lead and stepped back, giving him space. He didn't bolt. He lingered, watching me for a heartbeat that stretched long enough to feel intentional. Then he turned, trotting out into the grass, his movements fluid and free. I smiled, something warm blooming in my chest. It was the first time I'd witnessed his freedom up close, not contained by walls or routines. Watching him move like that stirred something in me, a bittersweet mix of joy and longing. Freedom wasn't just absence of boundaries, I realized. It was trust in what you'd built inside them. Life outside the stable continued, uneven and imperfect. There were days when the old weight pressed back in, when I woke with a tightness in my chest I couldn't explain, when shadows of the past crept in uninvited. But now, I had somewhere to take that heaviness. Somewhere it didn't feel like a burden I had to carry alone. The stable became a marker of time, before Ash, after Ash. I didn't notice the shift in me until someone else did. A coworker remarked one afternoon that I seemed lighter, more present. I brushed it off with a shrug, uncomfortable with being observed that closely. But later, alone in my apartment, I caught my reflection in the mirror and paused. My eyes looked different. Not happier. Not healed. Just open. The real test came on a day I hadn't prepared for. It started like any other clear sky. Soft breeze, the stable bathed in gentle light. I arrived later than usual, my mind cluttered with the stress of the week. Ash greeted me as always, calm and attentive, and I let myself sink into the familiar routine. I was brushing him when Ruth approached, her expression unreadable. "There's something I need to tell you," she said. The tone tightened something in my chest. I straightened, brush stilled in my hand. "Ash might be moving," she continued gently. "A family expressed interest. They have land, experience. It could be a good placement for him." The words hit harder than I expected. Moving. Placement. Good. All rational, all reasonable. And yet, My throat closed around them, my breath catching on something sharp and sudden. "Oh," I managed, the sound thin. "I see." Ruth watched me carefully. "Nothing's decided yet. I just thought you should know." I nodded, the motion automatic. The rest of the day blurred. I finished my tasks with a careful neutrality, every movement precise, controlled. Ash sensed the change immediately. He stayed close, his presence steady, unassuming. When the stable emptied and the light began to fade, I found myself alone with him again. The stall door stood open. The choice was mine. I stepped inside and closed it softly behind me. The familiar click echoed louder than usual. I leaned against the wall, brush hanging loosely at my side, and let the weight of the day settle. Ash stood before me, his eyes searching my face with that quiet intensity I'd come to recognize. "You might leave," I said aloud, the words tasting strange. "Did you know that?" My voice didn't shake. That surprised me. I expected panic, the old reflex to withdraw before I could be abandoned. Instead, what rose was sadness, deep, aching, but clean. Honest. Ash shifted, closing the space between us until his forehead hovered inches from my chest. I rested my hand there without thinking, grounding myself in the warmth of him. "I always leave first," I whispered. "That's been my rule. That way it doesn't hurt as much." The admission felt like laying something fragile on the ground between us, exposed, vulnerable. "But you taught me something," I continued. "About staying, about choosing to remain even when it's uncomfortable, even when it might end." Ash breathed, slow and even. I laughed softly, a sound edged with tears. "You didn't even mean to. You just were." The tears came then. Quiet, uncontained. They slid down my cheeks without drama, without shame. I didn't wipe them away. Ash didn't move. He let me have the moment. I stayed there a long time, letting the grief unfold naturally rather than shoving it aside. Letting myself feel the truth of attachment without labeling it as weakness. When the tears subsided, I felt emptied but not hollow. Cleaned out, like a storm had passed through and left the air clearer. "I don't know what will happen," I said finally, "but I know I won't disappear. It's Everidia." The words settled with unexpected weight. I opened the stall door and stepped out, leaving it ajar. Ash followed this time, stopping just short of crossing the threshold. We stood there, facing each other across that small boundary, the space charged with meaning. "Whatever comes next," I murmured, "thank you." Days passed. The family visited. They walked the paddock, spoke softly, asked the right questions. I watched from a distance, my heart steady but tender. Ash met them with polite curiosity, his demeanor calm and discerning. When the decision came, it wasn't a shock. He would go. I helped prepare him on the morning of his departure. My movements deliberate, reverent. I braided his mane loosely, brushed his coat until it gleamed. Every gesture felt like a goodbye wrapped in care rather than desperation. Ruth stood nearby, giving me space. She didn't say she was sorry. She didn't need to. When it was time, I led Ash out one last time. The trailer waited at the edge of the drive, its presence stark, but not cruel. I stopped before the ramp. Ash hesitated, sensing the shift. I placed my hand against his neck, breathing him in hay and earth and the quiet strength that had changed me. "You'll be okay," I said, my voice steady. "I know you will." And then, because this mattered, I let myself add, "So will I." Ash stepped forward, trusting. The sound of his hooves on the ramp echoed like punctuation, firm and final. I watched until the trailer doors closed, until the engine started, until the dust settled back into stillness. I didn't freeze. I stood there, heart aching, eyes wet, body present. When the trailer disappeared down the road, I exhaled slowly. The stable felt different without him. Larger, quieter, but not empty. I returned the halter to its place, my hands calm. I walked the aisle one last time, running my fingers along the familiar wood, imprinting the space into memory. At the door, I paused. For a moment, I expected the old urge to run, to retreat, to seal myself off before the absence could echo too loudly. Instead, I stepped outside and let the light hit my face. The world stretched on, imperfect and open. I didn't know what came next. I didn't need to, because I had learned something that would stay with me long after the hoofprints faded from the dirt. Staying doesn't mean clinging. Connection doesn't mean possession. And strength isn't the absence of pain, it's the willingness to remain present even when pain arrives. My name is Elena Moros. And once, in a quiet stable, a horse taught me how to stand inside my own life without running. The door closed. I didn't freeze. I opened myself instead. I didn't realize how much space he had taken up inside me until I started carrying that space with me everywhere else. The days after Ash left were quieter than I expected. Not hollow, just softer, like the world had turned its volume down. I still went to the stable. I still swept aisles, filled buckets, brushed coats that weren't his. The routines held, steady as ever. What changed was me. I noticed how I breathed now deeper, slower, as if my body remembered something my mind didn't have to argue with anymore. When anxiety brushed against me, it didn't immediately take over. It hovered, tested the ground. And often, it left. Sometimes, when the barn was empty and the late light spilled across the floor just right, I'd swear I could hear his breathing again. Not as a ghost. Not as longing. Just as memory doing what memory does, reminding me of a rhythm I could return to. I stopped measuring my progress in milestones. There was no finish line. No version of myself I was racing toward. Healing, I learned, wasn't a straight road. It was more like learning to stand comfortably in changing weather. One evening, I found myself back in the last stall on the left. It was empty now. I stepped inside anyway. The door stayed open. That felt important. I rested my hand against the wall where I used to lean, closed my eyes, and let myself feel it all at once. The gratitude, the ache, the quiet pride of not shutting down. My chest tightened, then eased. I stayed, I whispered again, but this time it wasn't a surprise. It was a statement. When I left the stable that night, I didn't look back expecting anything to be there. I carried what mattered with me. The stillness. The courage to remain. The understanding that connection could exist without permanence and still change you forever. Life didn't suddenly become easier, but it became truer. I spoke up more. I left rooms that felt wrong. I stayed in conversations that scared me. I let people see me pause, hesitate, breathe through uncertainty instead of pretending I was unbreakable. And sometimes on quiet mornings, when the world felt balanced just long enough, I smiled for no clear reason at all. Because somewhere along the way, without fanfare or rescue, I learned this. I am not something that needs to escape to survive. I am something that can stay. And that knowledge earned in a quiet stable, beside a horse who never asked me to be anything other than present, became the strongest thing I own.